Tonight on The Ghost Collector, 3 stories of things that appeared where they did not belong. A pale boy seen beneath the clear water of a mountain swimming hole. Something unseen moving through a darkened bedroom before crawling onto the bed. And a beloved dog who may have returned for one final ride. Welcome to The Ghost Collector, a collection of true stories of ghosts, hauntings, strange encounters, and the unexplained. I'm your host, Scott Weimer. Most of the stories you hear on this show are shared with me by people who experienced them. Unless otherwise noted, I retell those accounts in their place, preserving the details as they were given to me. Our first story tonight comes from Sherman. He and his friends often visited a mountain swimming hole known for its clear water, rocky cliffs, and a waterfall that emptied into a deep, perfectly round pool. It was a place he knew well. But one morning, after jumping into the water and opening his eyes beneath the surface, Sherman saw something at the bottom that he had never seen before. Something pale, something perfectly still. This is the pale figure below. Years ago, my friends and I used to drive into the mountains to a local swimming hole just outside Yosemite. It was a beautiful place. A waterfall dropped into an almost perfectly round pool carved into the rock. The water was unusually clear and fed by snowmelt, which meant it stayed painfully cold even in the middle of summer. Along one side of the pool was a small cave you could swim into. On the other side, the rock rose high above the water and gave people several different places to jump. There was a lower ledge near the waterfall for beginners. Then there was the main jump. And above that, there were a few places for people who were either very experienced or not particularly concerned about what might happen if they landed wrong. During the summer, the place could become packed. Cars lined the narrow road. Towels and ice chests covered every flat piece of ground. People waited in groups along the walks while everyone watched whoever was next to jump. My friends and I were all in our 20s then, and for 6 or 7 years we probably went there several times every summer. We knew the trail. We knew where to park. We knew which rocks were slippery and where the current from the waterfall would push you after you landed. At least we thought we knew the place. One morning I took my nephew Chad with me. He was about 12 years old and had been wanting to see the swimming hole for himself. I knew he probably would want to jump, but I also knew how intimidating the place could be when it was crowded. When dozens of people are standing along the edge watching, it's difficult to take your time. There's always someone behind you waiting, somebody shouting encouragement, somebody telling you not to be scared. I wanted Chad to be able to look at the jump, ask questions, and work up his nerve without feeling like he was holding everybody else up. So we left early. We arrived around 9:30 in the morning, well before the usual summer crowd. There were only a few cars parked nearby. We found a good spot and carried our towels and ice chests down to the pool. There were maybe 3 teenage boys already there, and 2 or 3 older adults gathered around the rocks. That was all. Compared with a normal afternoon, the place felt almost empty. We set our things in a shaded area beside the pool, and I began showing Chad around. I pointed out the safest route up the rocks to the main jumping spot. I showed him where people usually landed and explained that he needed to jump outward, away from the rock face. Then I showed him the lower ledge closer to the waterfall. It was not as high, but because it was nearer the falling water, the current was more noticeable there. It was a good place to practice, as long as you knew which direction to swim after entering the pool. Chad wanted me to jump first. Not just once. He wanted to watch exactly where I took off, where I entered the water, and how quickly I could swim away from the waterfall. I was not eager to be the first person in. The morning air was already warm, but the water came from melting snow farther up the mountain. Even after years of swimming there, I never became accustomed to that first shock. I climbed to the main ledge and looked down. The pool was clear, and from above you could see deep into the water. The surface reflected the surrounding rocks and trees, but beneath the glare, the water turned from green to blue and then to a dark, glassy depth. Chad stood where he could see me. I took a breath, stepped forward, and jumped. The cold hit instantly. It wrapped around my chest and drove the air out of me. I sank beneath the surface, surrounded by bubbles and the muffled roar of the waterfall. Then the bubbles cleared, and I opened my eyes. At first, I could not understand what I was seeing. Something pale was below me, far below me. The pool was deep, probably another 25 feet beneath where I hung in the water, and there appeared to be a person lying or floating near the bottom. A boy. He was very pale, almost white beneath the blue-green water. His hair was long and drifted around his head. His body seemed suspended just above the rock below him. His eyes were open but unfocused. So was his mouth. There was no movement to suggest that he was swimming. I'd often seen people with snorkel masks along the back half of the pool. The place was so clear that you could swim down and look for trinkets that people dropped, and treasure and bits of gold. But there was no indication that he was snorkeling. No bubbles, no effort to rise. He looked dead. The realization came all at once. I turned upward and began swimming as hard as I could. By the time I broke the surface, I was panicking. My first instinct was to shout that there was someone beneath the water. Then I saw Chad standing above me, watching to see how I handled the jump. I didn't want to frighten him. I forced a smile, raised one hand, and gave him a thumbs up. And I immediately put my face back in the water. The boy was gone. There was nothing beneath me except the pale rock at the bottom of the pool. I lifted my head and looked around. No one was climbing out of the water. No one was swimming toward the shore. No one stood dripping on the rocks as though they had just surfaced. The teenage boys were still where they had been. The adults had not moved. Chad remained above the pool, waiting for me to show him what to do next. There was no long-haired boy anywhere. I swam to the edge and pulled myself out. The entire time I expected someone to ask what was wrong. My heart was pounding, but I tried to act normally. I told myself that the cold water had shocked me. Maybe the sunlight had distorted something below. Maybe I'd seen a light-colored rock, or a submerged branch, or a reflection moving across the bottom. But I knew what rocks looked like underwater. I'd been swimming in that pool for years. And a rock did not have hair. A reflection did not have open eyes. I climbed back up onto the rocks and looked down from above. From that height, I could see almost all the way to the bottom, and there was nothing there. For the next few minutes, I avoided getting back in the water. I pretended my stomach hurt. I took too long rearranging things near the ice chest. I told Chad we should wait and watch the other boys jump first. He had no idea why I was suddenly hesitating. Eventually, I realized that I could not bring him all the way here and refused to let him swim. I also did not want him jumping in alone. So I suggested we use the lower ledge and go in together. I stood beside him near the waterfall, counting down while the spray drifted over the rocks. 3, 2, 1, and we jumped. The moment I hit the water, I kept my eyes closed. I did not want to look down again. I surfaced quickly, found Chad, and guided him toward the edge. He was laughing and excited, proud that he had done it. I tried to share his enthusiasm, but I wanted him out of that pool. I hurried him toward the rocks and encouraged him to climb up. When he wanted to jump again, I invented another reason to wait. The rocks were getting crowded. We should eat something. The water was too cold. We had a long drive home. I used every excuse I could think of. But Chad was having a good time, and all I could think about was leaving. I was afraid that if I entered the water again, I would see the boy waiting beneath me. Or worse, that this time he'd be closer. So we ended up not staying long. For years afterward, I tried to convince myself that I had misidentified something in the water. There had been no news of anybody drowning, nothing in the newspaper. Then, a couple years later, I was talking with a friend of a friend who worked as a sheriff's deputy in that part of the mountains. The swimming hole came up in conversation. He told me that he had responded to several drownings there over the years. He described one drowning in particular. When he arrived, the victim, a young male, was still visible at the bottom of the pool. The body could clearly be seen from above. But people kept swimming. Some of them knew there was a body below. They knew why the deputies and rescuers were there. And yet they still jumped into the water, surfaced, and swam across the pool while the young victim remained visible beneath them. I'm not suggesting that the victim he described was the same boy I saw. I do not know when that drowning occurred. I do not know what that victim looked like. And as the deputy was clear, there had been more than one death at that swimming hole. But his story changed the way I remembered the morning. Until then, I'd always thought of the pool as a place where someone might drown and disappear into the darkness below. I never considered that the water would remain so calm and clear that a drowned person might still be visible, lying silently beneath the swimmers who had no idea what was below them. Or swimmers who knew and chose to enter anyway. I find that shocking. It has been many years since that morning. I can still picture the waterfall, the round pool, and the sunlight on the rocks. I can still remember giving Chad a thumbs up so he would not know I was afraid. And I can still see that pale boy at the bottom, his long hair moving in the water, his eyes open, his mouth open, looking less like something that has suddenly appeared, and more like something who had been lying there for a long time. Thanks to Sherman for reminding me the details of that chilling story of the swimming hole. Like the location in the story, some encounters happen in places already touched by tragedy. Others happen in places that seem ordinary. Our next story takes us away from the cold water of a mountain swimming hole and into a quiet suburban bedroom, inside a house with no previous reason to be haunted. But late one night, the sounds began moving through the room, first near the windows, then beside the bed, and finally across the mattress itself. This is The Night Something Crawled Onto My Bed, and it's one of my experiences. In the late 1990s, I lived in a house that my friends and I usually referred to as the Ashcroft House. There was nothing about it that looked haunted. It wasn't an old Victorian with a dark history. It didn't have a scary attic, or a sealed-off room, or a nearby graveyard. It was an ordinary tract-style house built sometime in the late 1960s. The kind of house you could find in almost any West Coast neighborhood. From about 1995 until 2000, a lot of strange things happened. Enough that the stories from that house could probably fill an entire episode. Some of the experiences were shared. Others happened when someone was alone. There were unexplained noises, strange movements, and moments when the house seemed to come alive around us. But one of the nights I remember most clearly happened in 1999. I was getting ready for bed. My bedroom had its own bathroom, and before turning in, I closed the bathroom window. I remember pushing it firmly into place because the window normally sat very tight in its track. Once I was sure it was shut, I slid the bathroom door closed and stepped back into my bedroom. And almost immediately I heard the window slide. It was unmistakable. That scraping sound of glass moving inside a metal frame. And it happened only seconds after I had closed it. I stopped and looked back toward the bathroom door. My first thought wasn't paranormal. I thought someone might be outside. The window had sounded as though it had been pushed. For a moment I pictured somebody standing on the other side of the window, reaching up and trying to force it open. I approached the bathroom cautiously and opened the door. The window was still completely closed. It was one of those tiny bathroom windows, but I was still concerned that I was going to see the face of an intruder looking in. I thought someone had wandered into our small side yard. But it hadn't moved at all. I checked it again, and it was seated tightly in the frame, exactly as I left it. And it was locked. There didn't seem to be any explanation for the sound. Still, I was tired. I told myself it must be the house settling, or another window somewhere nearby. I went back into the bedroom, turned off the light, and climbed in the bed. My cat Milo was lying beside me near my hip. And not long after I settled in, I heard another noise. This one came from my bedroom window, right above my bed. It made a sharp cracking sound, similar to the noise a house sometimes makes when a strong gust of wind hits it. The frame or the glass seemed to flex suddenly under pressure. Except I don't remember there being any sort of storm or wind that night. It was summer. Then I heard something near the nightstand near my head. A small noise, like a clicking or a tapping coming from a few feet away. Then more. At first I tried to identify it logically. I wondered if I left a glass of ice water on the nightstand and the ice was melting or shifting, and it was making those sharp little cracking sounds. But when I looked toward the nightstand, there was no glass there. There was nothing obvious that should be making noise. Milo was still asleep beside me. Then the house cracked loudly again, this time from somewhere high in the corner of the bedroom. By then I began to wonder what the heck was happening. I understand that houses make noises. Wood expands and contracts, pipes move, windows shift in their frames. But these noises just didn't seem random. They felt as though they were moving around me. First the bathroom window, then the bedroom window, then the nightstand, then the upper corner of the room. It was circling around me. And after a short silence, the small noises started again. Tapping, clicking. I lay there listening. Then I felt the mattress move. The movement started near the top of the bed, close to my head. It felt like someone had climbed onto the mattress. Not a single jolt or vibration from somewhere else in the house. This was a series of small impressions moving across the bed, as though a lightweight animal were crawling beside my pillow. Then I felt the slightest brush against the side of my head. And that was when I panicked. For a moment, I assumed it had to be my cat Milo. He could have quietly gotten up and moved towards my pillow without me noticing. I reached down beside my hip to feel for him, and he was still there. He hadn't moved. He was lying in exactly the same spot, apparently asleep. So I jumped out of bed and turned on the light. My next thought was there might be a mouse or a rat in the room. We had never had one, but still, what could that noise be? What could the movement be? Maybe it had climbed onto the bed and moved through the blankets. I pulled things back, looked around, but there was no mouse. Then I wondered if my other cat, Cleo, might be hiding under the bed. So I checked beneath it, and there was nothing. There was no animal in that room that could account for what I'd felt. Milo remained on the bed, looking as though he had slept through the entire thing. I searched the room, but I couldn't find anything out of place. Eventually, with no explanation and nowhere else to sleep, I turned off the light and got back into bed. But the noises didn't stop. Then, a much louder noise came from somewhere out in the rest of the house. And I never found out the source of that sound either. And that's how the night ended. There was no figure standing in the room. Nothing appeared in the bathroom mirror. I didn't see a ghost beside the bed. But there was only the sound of a tightly closed window sliding open when it hadn't moved, the unexplained noises gathering around my bed, the mattress giving way beside my head, and something brushing lightly against me while both cats were somewhere else. It was one of those odd experiences that never provided a dramatic conclusion. Whatever had entered the room, or whatever had been moving through the house, simply seemed to lose interest. But the next morning I wrote the experience down. And more than 25 years later, I can still remember the moment I reached for Milo, expecting to find him beside my head, and realized he had never moved. There is one detail about that night that did not occur to me until many years later. The house stood only about 350 feet from a nearby fire station, a station with a long history of unexplained activity. Among the stories told by firefighters were incidents involving objects moving or things tapping and moving on the nightstands where they slept. At the time, I never connected the two. It was only recently, while revisiting my old journal and learning more about the fire station haunting, that I noticed how strangely similar the experiences were. Someone trying to sleep, small noises occurring next to the bed, and noises happening around the beds, and activity centered around the nightstands. Maybe it was only a coincidence, but the house and the station were separated by little more than the length of a football field, and both appeared to have something that liked to approach people while they were lying in the dark. Not every unexplained visitor, however, arrives to frighten us. Sometimes what returns is familiar, something we loved, something that once waited for us at the door, followed us from room to room, and seemed to understand when we needed companionship most. Our final story tonight comes from a friend who had recently earned his driver's license and was experiencing the freedom of taking the family car out on his own. But during one of those drives, he began to feel that he wasn't alone. There was a familiar presence in the car with him, the presence of a beloved dog who had died before they could ever take that ride together. This is Tony's last ride. I grew up in the foothills, on a large piece of family property that was part ranch, part wilderness, and about 6 miles from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where dogs didn't spend much time indoors. They followed you everywhere, down to the barn, out through the pasture, along the fences. Wherever the family went, the dogs went too. And when I was growing up, the dog who was always there was Tony. Tony was a Cocker Spaniel, although he never really seemed like the kind of dog you would picture lying on a cushion in somebody's living room. He was a ranch dog through and through. He had black, curly, wiry hair with patches of white, and I had known him for as long as I could remember. He was there through my entire childhood. We used to call him the little old man dog. Even when he was younger, Tony seemed older somehow. Not physically, but in the way he carried himself. He had this calm, knowing look, like he understood more than a dog was supposed to understand. He would sit quietly and watch everything going on around him, almost like he was keeping track of the family. He was loyal, smart, and surprisingly fast. When he decided to run, that little dog could move. But the thing Tony loved more than almost anything was riding in the car. It didn't matter where anyone was going. If a car door opened, Tony wanted in. A trip into town, a ride across the ranch, or just moving a vehicle from one side of the property to the other. It was all the same to him. To Tony, every ride was an adventure. When I was about 14 or 15, I started learning how to drive. We had a long dirt driveway that ran from the house all the way out to the main road. The mailbox sat at the far end, and my mom would sometimes let me drive down to get the mail. It wasn't exactly a long-distance trip, but to me, it felt like freedom. The car was an old station wagon with a manual transmission. It had a clutch, so learning to drive it involved a lot of stalling, jerking forward, and trying not to roll backward. And every time I went down that driveway, Tony wanted to come along. By then, he was already getting up there in age. He couldn't jump into the car as easily as he once had, so I would reach down, lift him up, and set him inside. He would settle into his spot as if we were about to drive across the state instead of just going down to the driveway to the mailbox. I would grind through the gears, Tony beside me, and make the slow trip down the dirt road. Those short drives became our thing, and I started making him a promise. I would tell him, when I get my driver's license, I'm going to take you out on a real ride. Not just down the driveway, not just to the mailbox, a real ride into town. I don't know how much of it he understood, but whenever I talked to him, he would look at me with that old, knowing expression of his, like he believed me. And as the years passed, Tony began to slow down. He had trouble climbing into cars and needed to be lifted almost every time. His coat became rougher, and he developed skin problems that looked like mange. And he had this unmistakable old dog smell. Anyone who has had an elderly dog probably knows the smell I mean. It doesn't matter how often he's washed or how often we try to clean him up, that smell always seemed to come back. It wasn't pleasant, but it was Tony. It was a part of him. And even as he became older and slower, he remained a constant presence around the ranch. He was always nearby, watching, following, waiting for the next car door to open. I kept practicing my driving, and I kept telling him that once I had my license, he and I were going to take that trip down to town. But Tony was very old, and not long before I was able to get my permit, he died. For the first time in my life, he wasn't there. No Tony walking behind us through the property, no little old man dog watching from the porch or waiting near the car, and no passenger waiting to be lifted into the station wagon. I had always assumed when I finally got my license, Tony would still be there. I had promised him that ride, but I never got the chance to give it to him. Eventually, I passed my test and received my driver's license. By then, I had also bought my first vehicle, a Ford Ranchero. I was proud of that car. To me, it represented independence. For the first time, I could leave the ranch by myself and drive the 6 miles into town. The day finally came for my first solo trip. I remember getting into the Ranchero with my new driver's license in hand. I was excited and probably a little nervous. I started the engine, put the car into gear, and began backing down the long dirt driveway. It should have felt like the beginning of something new. But before I had made it very far, I smelled something. It was strong, familiar, and completely unmistakable. Tony's old dog smell. The same smell that had clung to his fur no matter how many times he had been washed. The same smell that filled the station wagon whenever I lifted him into the seat beside me. And it was suddenly inside the ranchero. I had only recently bought the vehicle. Tony had never been inside it. In fact, he had died before I ever owned it. There was no blanket of his in the car, no collar, no hair, nothing that could have carried his scent. But there it was, as clear as if he were sitting beside me. I kept backing down the driveway, and the smell remained, and I knew exactly what it meant. I had promised Tony that when I finally got my driver's license, I would take him on a real ride into town. He hadn't forgotten. Maybe he was waiting. Maybe, in whatever way was possible, that loyal little old man dog had come back for the ride I promised him. So I drove the 6 miles into town, and Tony came with me. Thanks to Brian for sharing that story about his dog Tony. Brian has also shared several other spooky stories about the ranch he grew up on, and I'm looking forward to sharing those stories with you soon. And thanks for listening to The Ghost Collector. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, be sure to follow, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys true paranormal tales. If you have a true paranormal story, or even secondhand one, that you'd like to share, you can reach out to scott@theghostcollector.com or by visiting theghostcollector.com. You can also use your phone's voice recorder to record your experience and email it to the show. For additional information, photos, and original sources related to tonight's stories, visit theghostcollector.com. If you have a real paranormal experience, maybe it's time to let someone collect it. Music and sound effects used in this episode were sourced from freesound.org and are licensed under Creative Commons Attribution. Full source details are available at theghostcollector.com. Thanks for listening.